The Great Hall of the Galactic Confederation stretched across 3 kilometers of polished crystal floor. Representatives from 47 different species sat in their designated zones, each area carefully designed to meet the specific environmental needs of its occupants. The Zephyrians floated in their glass chambers filled with methane gas, their crystalline bodies catching the soft light and throwing rainbow patterns across the walls. The Nebulae Collective existed as living clouds of particles, contained within force fields that shimmered like soap bubbles. The insectoid Kythera buzzed quietly in their hive clusters, thousands of individual minds working as one. Today, however, the usual sounds of diplomatic discussion had fallen silent. Fear hung in the air like a thick fog, touching every corner of the vast chamber. The emergency session had been called after the latest reports arrived from the Outer Rim territories. The news was worse than anyone had dared imagine. Ambassador Thicksol of the Zephyrians stood at the central podium, his crystal form trembling slightly as he activated the holographic display. The image that appeared above the assembly showed a star system that had existed just 3 weeks ago. Now, where 12 planets had once orbited their sun, there was nothing but empty space and floating debris. Even the star itself looked different, dimmer, as if something had drained away part of its energy. The Kepler 442 system, Thicksol announced, his voice carrying through the translation devices. Home to the peaceful gardener species. Population 4 billion souls. As of today, they no longer exist. A collective shudder ran through the assembly. The gardeners had been known throughout the galaxy for their wisdom and their beautiful floating cities. Their art and poetry had touched countless civilizations. Now they were gone, wiped out in less than a day. This marks the 7th complete system loss in the past month, continued Thicksol. The entity responsible moves faster than our fastest ships. It consumes everything in its path. Our military analysts have given it a designation: the Void Shepherds. The hologram changed to show blurry recordings from long-range sensors. Dark shapes moved between the stars, too distant to make out clearly. They seemed to bend light around them, creating distortions in space itself. Whatever technology they used was beyond anything the Confederation had encountered. High Counselor Vexith of the Aquatic Assembly raised one of her tentacles to speak. Her tank of blue-green water bubbled as she formed words. What do we know about their origin? Have they made any attempt at communication? Thicksol's form flickered with distress. Nothing. No response to any of our peace offerings or diplomatic messages. They simply arrive, consume everything, and move on. Our best xenobiologists believe they may not even recognize us as intelligent life. A chorus of worried sounds echoed through the chamber. The reptilian Sauran delegation hissed softly among themselves. The plant-like Verdani rustled their leaves in agitation. Even the normally calm ethereals, beings of pure energy, flickered with anxiety. General Korath of the Unified Defense Fleet stepped forward. His forearms gestured at tactical displays that showed the positions of Confederation forces. Our combined fleets have engaged the Void Shepherds 3 times. Each encounter resulted in total defeat. They destroyed our ships without taking any apparent damage. Whatever weapons they possess, our shields and armor are useless against them. The silence that followed was heavy with despair. For 3,000 years, the Galactic Confederation had maintained peace through diplomacy and cooperation. Wars were rare, and when they did occur, they were settled quickly through mediation or economic pressure. The member species had grown comfortable with this civilized approach to conflict resolution. None of them were prepared for an enemy that could not be reasoned with or defeated through conventional means. Ambassador Linth of the Silicon Collective spoke next, her rocky form grinding slightly as she moved. Perhaps we should consider evacuation protocols. If we cannot stop them, we might be able to preserve some of our populations by fleeing to other galaxies. The suggestion caused an uproar. Representatives began speaking over each other, their translation devices creating a chaotic mix of languages and concepts. The idea of abandoning their home galaxy was almost unthinkable. These civilizations had spent millennia building their societies, their cultures, their entire way of life. To give it all up and flee into the unknown felt like admitting defeat before they had truly tried to fight. High Arbiter Nexus, the ancient AI that served as the Confederation's neutral mediator, raised his metallic hand for silence. His voice was calm and mechanical, cutting through the chaos. Order. We must consider all options no matter how distasteful. However, before we discuss retreat, Perhaps we should explore every possible avenue for resistance. Counselor Vexith's tentacles swayed thoughtfully. General Korath mentioned that our conventional forces have failed. But the Confederation includes many species with unique abilities. Have we considered unconventional approaches? General Korath's expression was grim. We have consulted with our best strategic minds. The Mentalist Collective attempted to contact the Void Shepherds telepathically, but found nothing they could recognize as consciousness. The Time Weavers tried to study the enemy's past, but reported that the Shepherds seemed to exist outside normal temporal flow. Even the reality-manipulating Shapers cannot seem to affect them. The fear in the chamber grew thicker. If the most powerful species in the galaxy could not touch these invaders, what hope did anyone have? Ambassador Thyxol cleared his throat, a sound like wind chimes in a breeze. There is one option we have not yet discussed, but I hesitate to mention it as many here would consider it barbaric. All eyes turned to him. High Arbiter Nexus leaned forward. Speak freely, Ambassador. Desperate times may require desperate measures. Thyxol's crystal form darkened slightly, a sign of embarrassment among his people, the humans. The species from the Sol system. The reaction was immediate and negative. Hisses, buzzes, and various sounds of disgust echoed through the chamber. The human species had been admitted to the Confederation only 30 years ago, and their inclusion had been controversial from the beginning. The Deathworlders? Asked Counselor Vexith with obvious distaste. What could those primitive savages possibly offer? General Korath nodded in agreement. Their technology is centuries behind ours. Their ships are crude, their weapons inefficient. They have barely mastered interstellar travel. Yes, said Thyxol slowly, but they have something we do not. They come from a world where survival required constant violence and adaptation. They are used to fighting impossible odds. More importantly, they seem to enjoy it. The chamber fell silent again, but this time the silence was thoughtful rather than fearful. The human homeworld, Earth, was classified as a death world by Confederation standards. Its gravity was higher than most species could tolerate. Its weather was violent and unpredictable. Its native life forms were aggressive and dangerous. Most civilized species considered it a miracle that any intelligence had evolved there at all. High Arbiter Nexus processed this information for several seconds before speaking. You suggest that humanity's violent nature might be an advantage against an enemy that cannot be reasoned with or defeated through conventional means. I suggest, said Thyxol carefully, that when facing an enemy that consumes entire civilizations, perhaps we need allies who understand destruction. The debate that followed lasted for hours. Some representatives argued that humans were too dangerous to trust with such a critical mission. Others pointed out that humanity had proven surprisingly reliable as Confederation members, despite their aggressive tendencies. Finally, as reports arrived of yet another system falling to the Void Shepherds, a vote was called. By the narrowest of margins, the decision was made. A formal request for assistance would be sent to the human government on Earth, the galaxy's greatest. Hope now rested with the species that most of them still considered barely civilized. As the representatives filed out of the Great Hall, many of them wondered if they had just made the right choice or signed their own death warrants. Time would tell if the Deathworlders could succeed where everyone else had failed. The message arrived at Earth's orbital command station exactly 72 hours after the Confederation vote. Admiral Sarah Chen stood in the communications center, reading the formal request that had just been decoded from the alien transmission. Around her, technicians and officers worked quietly at their stations, processing the flood of data that came with interstellar diplomacy. Sarah had been expecting this call. Earth's listening posts had been picking up fragments of emergency transmissions from the inner galaxy for weeks. Something big was happening out there. Something that had the alien civilizations scared enough to break their usual communication protocols. Admiral, called Lieutenant Martinez from his station, we're receiving a priority transmission from Geneva. The World Assembly wants an immediate briefing on the Confederation request. Sarah nodded and activated the secure channel. The face of Secretary General Kim appeared on her screen, looking tired and worried. Behind him, she could see other world leaders gathering in the emergency session chamber. Admiral Chen, Kim began without preamble. I assume you've read the alien message. What's your assessment? Sarah glanced at the translation one more time before answering. It's genuine, sir. The Confederation is facing an existential threat. They're describing an enemy that can destroy entire star systems in days. Their combined fleets have been completely ineffective. And they want our help, said President Harrison, leaning into the camera frame. Why us? Our technology is primitive compared to theirs. That's exactly why they need us, Sarah replied. According to their message, conventional tactics have failed completely. The enemy doesn't respond to diplomacy, can't be affected by their most advanced weapons, and seems to exist outside normal space-time. They need someone who thinks differently. The leaders exchanged glances. Secretary General Kim spoke for all of them. Admiral, you've had more contact with alien species than anyone else on Earth. In your professional opinion, is this request legitimate? And should we respond? Sarah had been thinking about this question since the message arrived. Humanity's relationship with the Galactic Confederation had been complicated from the beginning. Most alien species viewed humans as dangerous primitives from a death world. They were tolerated but not respected, included in the Confederation more out of political necessity than genuine acceptance. Sir, I believe this threat is real. The level of fear in their message is something I've never seen from the Confederation before. These are species that have had peace for thousands of years. They don't know how to fight a war of survival. But we do, said General Thompson, joining the conversation from the Pentagon. Earth has been at war with something or someone for our entire history. Climate, predators, diseases, each other. We've never had the luxury of assuming the universe was safe. Secretary General Kim was quiet for a moment, weighing the decision. If we agree to help, what would you need? Sarah had already been planning for this possibility. Full authorization to mobilize the Space Navy. I'll need our best ships and crews, plus support from the Stellar Marines. Most importantly, I'll need permission to operate without Confederation oversight. If we're going to succeed, we can't be limited by their rules of engagement. The discussion that followed lasted 2 hours. Earth's leaders debated the risks and benefits of getting involved in an alien war. Some argued that humanity should focus on defending the Sol system, rather than venturing into unknown dangers. Others pointed out that if this enemy was consuming entire civilizations, Earth would eventually be threatened anyway. Finally, the vote was taken. By a significant margin, Earth's World Assembly agreed to provide military assistance to the Galactic Confederation. Admiral Chen was given full authority to conduct operations as she saw fit. 3 days later, Sarah stood on the bridge of the UES Defiance, humanity's newest and most advanced warship. Around her, the crew worked with quiet efficiency, preparing for departure. Through the main viewport, she could see the rest of the human fleet assembling in formation. 12 heavy cruisers, 36 destroyers, and 2 carrier ships loaded with fighter squadrons. By alien standards, it was a small force. By human standards, it represented the largest military deployment in spacefaring history. Admiral, called Commander Park from the navigation station, all ships report ready for hyperspace jump. Courses laid in for the Confederation staging area. Sarah activated the fleet-wide communication system. All ships, this is Admiral Chen. In a few minutes, we will leave Earth's solar system to face an enemy unlike anything humanity has encountered before. The aliens who called for our help consider us primitive and violent. They're not wrong. We come from a world that tried to kill us every day, and we survived by being tougher and more stubborn than anything else in the galaxy. She paused, looking out at the ships that would follow her into battle. The enemy we're facing has destroyed civilizations that are thousands of years older than ours. They have technology we can barely understand, but they've made one mistake. They've never fought anyone who grew up on a death world. They've never faced an enemy that thinks losing everything is just another Tuesday. Across the fleet, crews secured their stations and checked their weapons one final time. These men and women had volunteered for a mission that would take them further from home than any human had ever traveled. They knew the odds were against them, but that had never stopped humans before. Remember, Sarah continued, we're not just fighting for Earth. We're fighting for every species in the galaxy that doesn't know how to be afraid and dangerous at the same time. We're going to show them what Deathworlders can do when everything is on the line. The response from the fleet was immediate and enthusiastic. Crew members cheered, shouted battle cries, and prepared for what might be their final mission. The sound of human voices raised in defiance echoed through the command channels. Fleet Command, this is Admiral Chen. Execute hyperspace jump on my mark. Sarah took one last look at Earth. a blue and white marble hanging in the darkness. Mark. The stars outside the viewport stretched into lines of light as the human fleet disappeared into hyperspace, carrying with them the hopes of a galaxy that didn't know if its newest members were saviors or just another form of destruction. Behind them, Earth continued its slow rotation, unaware that its children had just taken the first step toward either saving the galaxy or dying in the attempt. In government buildings around the world, leaders waited for news from the front lines, knowing that they had just committed humanity to a war that would determine the fate of countless worlds. The journey to the Confederation staging area would take 6 days at maximum hyperspace velocity. During that time, Sarah and her staff worked around the clock, studying every piece of intelligence they had received about the Void Shepherds. The enemy's technology was beyond human understanding, but their tactics seemed straightforward. Arrive, consume everything, move on to the next target. What troubled Sarah most was the complete lack of communication from the enemy. Every war in human history had involved some form of dialogue, even if it was just threats and demands. These Void Shepherds said nothing, demanded nothing, explained nothing. They simply erased entire civilizations from existence. On the 4th day of their journey, they received an update from the Confederation. Another system had fallen, this time one with a population of 12 billion. The report was clinical and brief, but Sarah could read the fear between the lines. The aliens were running out of time and hope. When the human fleet finally dropped out of hyperspace at the designated coordinates, they found themselves facing the largest military gathering in galactic history. Ships from dozens of species filled the space around a massive battle station, their exotic designs creating a forest of alien technology. The sight was both inspiring and intimidating, a reminder of how young humanity was compared to these ancient civilizations. "Admiral," reported Lieutenant Commander Singh from the communications station, "we're receiving a transmission from the Confederation flagship. They're requesting permission to come aboard for a strategy briefing." Sarah straightened her uniform and checked her appearance one final time. "Tell them they're welcome aboard, and remind all crew that our guests consider us barely civilized. Let's try not to prove them right." As she prepared to meet with the alien commanders, Sarah couldn't help but smile grimly. These ancient species had called for help from the young race they considered savage and primitive. They were about to learn exactly what those savages could do when cornered. The real war was about to begin. The conference room aboard the Confederation flagship was a marvel of engineering designed to accommodate multiple alien species. The atmosphere was carefully controlled to support dozens of different respiratory systems, while gravity fields created zones of varying strength to match each delegation's needs. Admiral Sarah Chen sat at the human section of the table, surrounded by beings that represented millions of years of evolution on worlds humanity could barely imagine. General Korath of the Unified Defense Fleet stood at the center of the room, his 4 arms manipulating holographic displays that showed the current tactical situation. The images were grim. Red markers indicated systems that had already fallen to the Void Shepherds, while yellow ones showed locations under immediate threat. The pattern of destruction formed a rough sphere that was expanding outward from the galactic rim. "The enemy's advance has been consistent," Korath explained, his translated voice carrying overtones of despair. "They consume an average of 2 systems per week, with no apparent preference for military targets versus civilian populations. Our attempts to evacuate threatened areas have saved some lives, but the refugees have nowhere safe to go." Ambassador Thicksall of the Zephyrians flickered with distress as he addressed the assembly. "Our analysts estimate that at their current rate of expansion, the Void Shepherds will reach the core worlds within 18 months. The Confederation's population centers, our greatest libraries, our most sacred sites, all will be lost." Sarah studied the tactical display, noting the patterns that the alien commanders seemed to be missing. "General Korath, you mentioned that your forces have engaged the enemy 3 times. Can you show us the battle recordings?" The hologram shifted to display footage from the most recent engagement. Sarah watched as elegant alien warships maneuvered in perfect formation, their crews following doctrine that had been refined over centuries of limited conflicts. The ships maintained proper spacing, used energy weapons at maximum range, and retreated in good order when their shields began to fail. It was exactly the kind of warfare that civilized species would develop after thousands of years of peace. The Void Shepherds, by contrast, moved like living nightmares. Their ships seemed to bend space around them, appearing and disappearing without warning. When they attacked, reality itself seemed to twist, causing the Confederation vessels to simply cease existing. There were no explosions, no debris fields, just empty space where proud warships had been moments before. "You're fighting them like they follow the same rules you do," Sarah said after the recording ended. "But they don't. They're not interested in honor or proper tactics or minimizing casualties. They just want to erase you." High Counselor Vexith raised one of her tentacles in a gesture of confusion. How else would one fight? Surely there are principles that govern all forms of combat. Sarah almost laughed, then remembered where she was. These beings had evolved on worlds where cooperation was necessary for survival. Their conflicts had been resolved through negotiation and compromise for so long that they had forgotten what real war looked like. "On Earth," Sarah began, "we have a saying, 'All's fair in love and war.' It means that when survival is at stake, you use whatever works, regardless of whether it's honorable or civilized. You fight dirty, you take risks, and you never give your enemy what they expect." Commander Park, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "Admiral, if I may, I've been analyzing the enemy's attack patterns. They seem to expect resistance at long range, followed by organized retreat when resistance fails. They're not prepared for close-quarters combat or kamikaze attacks." The alien representatives looked confused by the unfamiliar term. General Korath's translator struggled with the concept before settling on suicide attack in Standard Galactic. The reaction was immediate and horrified. "You cannot seriously be suggesting that sentient beings deliberately destroy themselves in combat," said Ambassador Linth of the Silicon Collective. "Such actions violate every principle of civilized warfare." Sarah stood up, her human height making her tower over most of the seated aliens. "Ambassador, with respect, your principles of civilized warfare are exactly why you're losing. The Void Shepherds don't care about your rules. They don't care about honor or preserving life or fighting fair. They just want to win." She activated her own holographic display, showing tactical simulations that the human fleet had been running during their journey. "Look at your battle formations. You maintain safe distances. You retreat when shields drop to critical levels. You never risk valuable ships unless the odds are favorable. These are all smart tactics when you're fighting other civilized species who think the same way." The display showed human ships moving in seemingly chaotic patterns, closing to point-blank range, ramming enemy vessels, and continuing to fight even after taking critical damage. But against an enemy that exists to destroy you completely, playing it safe is just another way of dying slowly. High Arbiter Nexus, the ancient AI mediator, processed this information for several seconds before speaking. "Admiral Chen, you are suggesting that humanity's violent nature is actually an advantage in this conflict. I'm suggesting that we know how to fight dirty because we had to learn. Every species in this room evolved on worlds that were safe enough to allow cooperation and peaceful development. Earth was trying to kill us from the moment we crawled out of the oceans. We survived by being meaner, tougher, and more desperate than everything else on our planet." Sarah gestured to her human officers. "Every person in this room grew up hearing stories about impossible victories. Thermopylae, where 300 soldiers held off an army of hundreds of thousands. The Battle of Britain, where outnumbered pilots fought until their planes fell apart. D-Day, where men charged into machine gun fire because someone had to take the beach." The alien representatives listened in fascination and horror as Sarah described these ancient human conflicts. The scale of violence was beyond their comprehension, but they were beginning to understand that humanity had been forged by exactly this kind of desperate warfare. Captain Torres of the destroyer UES Revenge stepped forward. "Admiral, if I may add something? I've been studying the Void Shepherds' movement patterns. They always attack the strongest defensive positions first, probably because they're used to breaking organized resistance quickly. But what if we don't give them organized resistance?" Sarah nodded approvingly. "Go on, Captain." "Instead of meeting them with battle lines and coordinated fleet actions, we hit them with small groups acting independently. Wolfpack tactics. Strike fast, hit hard, and disappear before they can respond. Force them to chase shadows while our main fleet repositions for maximum impact." General Korath's expression showed clear skepticism. "Such tactics would result in heavy losses among the attacking forces. No reasonable commander would authorize such wasteful operations." "You're right," Sarah agreed. No reasonable commander would. But sometimes unreasonable is exactly what you need. She looked around the room at the assembled representatives. The question is, are you desperate enough to let the Deathworlders fight this war the way we know how to fight it? The silence that followed was heavy with implications. These civilizations had called for human help, but they were only now beginning to understand what that really meant. Working with humanity would require them to abandon thousands of years of military doctrine and accept tactics that violated their deepest principles about the value of life and the rules of war. Ambassador Thicksall was the first to speak, his crystal form flickering with determination. The Zephyrian Republic will support whatever tactics give us the best chance of survival. We did not call upon the humans expecting them to fight as we do. One by one, the other representatives voiced their agreement. Some spoke eagerly, others with obvious reluctance, but all recognized that conventional approaches had failed completely. High Arbiter Nexus formally recorded the decision. By unanimous consent, Admiral Chen and the human forces are authorized to conduct operations against the Void Shepherds using whatever methods they deem necessary. Confederation forces will provide support as requested. Sarah felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. The entire galaxy was counting on humanity to succeed where everyone else had failed. Thank you. We'll need complete tactical freedom and access to your intelligence networks. Most importantly, your people need to understand that we're going to lose ships and crews. A lot of them. That's the price of fighting an enemy like this. As the meeting broke up and the various species returned to their ships, Sarah remained behind with her senior officers. They had planning to do and very little time to do it. Thoughts? She asked her staff. Commander Park spoke first. The aliens are scared enough to give us carte blanche, but they don't really understand what they're asking for. When we start taking heavy casualties, they might change their minds. Then we better make sure our casualties count for something, Sarah replied. Captain Torres, I want you to select the most aggressive commanders in the fleet. We're going to need people who can make split-second decisions without waiting for orders. Captain Torres grinned fiercely. I know just the people, Admiral. Question is, are we really going to ram these things? Sarah looked out the viewport at the assembled alien fleet, so large and impressive and completely unprepared for the first human engagement with the Void Shepherds, took place in the Kepler 438 system, 3 days after the strategy conference. Captain Marcus Torres led a squadron of 6 destroyers against an enemy force that had just finished consuming the system's outer planets. The alien observers positioned themselves at what they considered a safe distance, expecting to witness another swift defeat. Instead, they watched in amazement and horror as the human ships did something no one had attempted before. They charged directly at the enemy. Captain Torres stood on the bridge of the UES Hurricane, watching the dark shapes of the Void Shepherds grow larger on his tactical display. His crew worked with quiet efficiency around him, checking weapon systems and preparing for the kind of close-quarters combat that hadn't been seen in space warfare for centuries. Range to target, 800 kilometers and closing, reported Lieutenant Walsh from the weapons station. Enemy vessels are maintaining formation, no evasive action detected. Torres nodded grimly. The Void Shepherds weren't trying to avoid the human ships because they had never needed to. Every previous engagement had been fought at maximum weapons range, with the Confederation forces retreating as soon as their shields failed. The concept of an enemy deliberately closing distance was apparently beyond their experience. Signal the squadron, Torres ordered. Execute attack pattern Delta. All ships full acceleration toward the lead enemy vessel. Fire everything we have when we hit point-blank range. The 6 human destroyers spread into a loose formation and accelerated hard toward the nearest Void Shepherd vessel. The enemy ship was enormous, easily 10 times the size of any human vessel, its dark hull seeming to absorb light rather than reflect it. Energy patterns played across its surface in designs that hurt to look at directly. At 500 kilometers, the Void Shepherds finally responded. Space around the human ships twisted and warped as reality-distorting weapons activated. The UES Defiant, flying on Torres's left flank, simply vanished as the fabric of space-time folded around it. 43 human lives ended in an instant, but the remaining ships continued their charge. Hull stress increasing, called Chief Engineer Morgan from his station. Whatever they're doing to space around us is affecting our structural integrity. Hold together for 30 more seconds, Torres replied, his hands gripping the command chair as the ship shuddered around him. That's all we need. At 200 kilometers, a second destroyer disappeared into a fold in reality. The UES tornado dissolved into component atoms as exotic forces tore it apart at the molecular level, but now the surviving human ships were close enough to use their most devastating weapons. "All ships, fire everything," Torres shouted into the communication system. 4 human destroyers opened fire at point-blank range with every weapon they possessed. Nuclear missiles, particle beams, kinetic slugs, and experimental plasma cannons all struck the Void Shepherd vessel simultaneously. The alien ship's shields, designed to deflect long-range attacks, were overwhelmed by the concentrated firepower. For the first time in the war, a Void Shepherd vessel took damage. The enemy ship's hull cracked and split, revealing internal structures that glowed with unnatural light. Dark fluid that might have been blood or coolant leaked into space. The ship's reality-distorting field flickered and failed, causing it to become visible to normal sensors for the first time. "Target damaged," Walsh reported with excitement, reading massive power fluctuations across their primary systems. But the victory came at a terrible cost. The wounded Void Shepherd vessel released a pulse of energy that caught the UES Thunder at close range. Torres watched helplessly as his fellow captain and crew were reduced to their component atoms. Of the 6 ships that had begun the attack, only 3 remained. "All ships withdraw to secondary positions," Torres ordered. "We've proved they can be hurt. Now let's see how they respond to being hurt." The human survivors pulled back to a safer distance, but the Void Shepherds didn't pursue. Instead, the damaged vessel began to emit signals that were quickly answered by the rest of their force. Within minutes, 3 additional enemy ships arrived in the system, their dark hulls emerging from hyperspace like nightmares made real. But something had changed. The newcomers approached the battle zone cautiously, scanning the debris field where 3 human ships had been destroyed. They were learning to be afraid. Admiral Chen received the battle report while reviewing intelligence data in her quarters aboard the UES Defiance. The news was both encouraging and sobering. Humanity had achieved something no other species had managed, but the cost had been severe. Half of Torres's squadron was gone, and they had only managed to damage a single enemy vessel. "Admiral," called Commander Park over the intercom, "you need to see the Confederation's response to the battle report." Sarah made her way to the command center, where a dozen alien representatives were gathered around the tactical displays. Their expressions ranged from amazement to horror as they reviewed the recordings from the engagement. "Impossible," whispered General Korath, his 4 arms trembling slightly. "They actually damaged a Void Shepherd vessel. How did they survive long enough to get so close?" Ambassador Thickcell's crystal form was flickering rapidly with excitement. The humans ignored all standard tactical doctrine. They accepted losses that any reasonable force would consider unacceptable, and it worked. High Counselor Vexith raised a tentacle in confusion. "But they lost half their ships. How can this be considered a victory?" Sarah stepped forward to address the gathering. "Because now we know they can be hurt. Every previous engagement ended with complete Confederation losses and no enemy damage. We traded 3 ships for proof that the Void Shepherds aren't invincible." Dr. Elena Vasquez, the human fleet's chief science officer, activated her own display showing detailed scans from the battle. "More importantly, we got sensor readings from the damaged enemy vessel. Their technology isn't magic, it's just very advanced. The hull breach revealed internal structures that appear to be partially organic." The alien representatives leaned closer to examine the data. What they saw changed everything they thought they knew about their enemy. The Void Shepherds weren't purely mechanical constructs as had been assumed. They were cyborgs, fusions of living tissue and exotic technology. "If they're partially biological," said Commander Park, "then biological weapons might be effective against them. We just need to understand their physiology well enough to design targeted agents." Dr. Vasquez nodded enthusiastically. "I'm already working on that. The tissue samples we collected from the damaged ship show cellular structures unlike anything in our databases, but they still follow basic biological principles. Given time, I can develop something that will target their organic components." The implications were staggering. For the first time since the war began, there was hope for something beyond a fighting retreat. The galaxy might actually have a chance to defeat the Void Shepherds rather than just slow them down, but success would require more battles like the one Captain Torres had just fought. More human ships would be lost, more crews would die, and the Confederation would have to watch their supposed saviors seemingly throwaway lives with reckless abandon. "How many more engagements like this can your forces sustain?" asked General Korath with obvious concern. Sarah considered the question carefully. The human fleet wasn't large by galactic standards, and they couldn't afford to lose ships faster than they could gather intelligence. "Enough," she said finally. "We didn't come here to play it safe. We came here to win." Over the following weeks, human squadrons engaged Void Shepherd forces across a dozen systems. Each battle followed the same pattern. Humans would charge directly at the enemy, accept heavy losses to get close enough for effective attacks, and withdraw with precious intelligence data. The cost was terrible. Nearly a third of the human fleet was destroyed in these engagements with thousands of casualties. But each battle revealed new weaknesses in the enemy's technology and tactics. More importantly, the Void Shepherds began to change their behavior in response to human attacks. They started deploying in defensive formations. They began retreating when faced with determined close-range assaults. They even attempted to communicate, sending mathematical signals that human cryptographers were working to decode. For species that had existed for millions of years without changing their fundamental nature, this adaptation was revolutionary. The humans weren't just damaging Void Shepherd ships. They were forcing an ancient enemy to evolve. Dr. Vasquez finally achieved her breakthrough after analyzing tissue samples from 5 different enemy vessels. Working around the clock with the best xenobiologists from a dozen species, she developed a biological agent that would target the organic components of Void Shepherd technology. "It's essentially a virus," she explained to Admiral Chen and the assembled alien representatives. "It attacks the neural pathways that connect their biological and mechanical systems. Without those connections, their ships should become inert." The weapon was loaded into specially modified missiles and distributed to the remaining human ships. The next engagement would test whether humanity's sacrifices had been worth the cost. The final battle took place at the nexus point where 3 major hyperspace routes converged, a strategic location that the Void Shepherds had chosen for their assault on the Confederation's core worlds. Admiral Sarah Chen stood on the bridge of the UES Defiance, watching as the largest enemy force yet assembled emerged from hyperspace. The dark ship seemed to drink in the light of nearby stars, creating shadows in space itself. "Tactical assessment," Sarah ordered, her voice calm despite the magnitude of what they faced. Commander Park consulted his displays with grim efficiency. 237 enemy vessels ranging from destroyer class to what appear to be mobile fortress platforms. Our combined force numbers 86 ships, including 31 human vessels. The numbers were sobering. Even with the biological weapons Dr. Vasquez had developed, they were outnumbered nearly 3-1 by an enemy that had never been truly defeated. The Confederation fleet hung back at maximum sensor range, their crews trained for defensive actions and organized retreats. But something had changed in the weeks since the first human engagement. The alien crews were no longer looking for ways to minimize risk and preserve their ships. They were looking to the human vessels for leadership, waiting to see what impossible thing the Deathworlders would attempt next. "Signal from the Confederation flagship," reported Lieutenant Martinez. "General Korath is requesting final battle instructions." Sarah activated the fleet-wide communication system, knowing that her next words would be heard by thousands of beings from dozens of species. "All ships, this is Admiral Chen. Today we end this war one way or another. The enemy has gathered their full strength because they believe they can break through to the core worlds and finish what they started." She paused, looking out at the mixed fleet of human and alien vessels. Ships designed by species that had known peace for millennia flew alongside human warships built for the violent realities of Earth's history. "They're right that this battle will be decisive, but they're wrong about who's going to win it." The Void Shepherds were already moving into their attack formation, the massive fortress platforms taking position at the center, while smaller vessels spread out in a defensive screen. It was the same pattern they had used in previous engagements, refined and perfected over millions of years of conquest. Sarah studied the enemy formation and made her decision. "All human vessels, form up on the Defiance. We're going straight through their center. Confederation ships, wait for our signal, then follow us in. Remember, the biological weapons only work at close range. We need to get inside their defensive perimeter. Captain Torres, now flying the replacement destroyer UES Retribution, came alongside the Admiral's ship. His voice crackled over the communication system. "Admiral, those fortress platforms are protected by overlapping reality distortion fields. Any ship that gets close enough to deploy biological weapons will be torn apart." "I know," Sarah replied simply. "That's why we're going to ram them." The silence that followed was profound. Even the human crews, who had grown accustomed to their admiral's aggressive tactics, were stunned by the magnitude of what she was proposing. The alien commanders were beyond horrified. "Admiral Chen," General Korath's voice carried clear distress, "you cannot seriously be planning to sacrifice your entire fleet in a single attack. Such losses would be meaningless if they don't achieve victory." Sarah's response was broadcast to every ship in the combined fleet. "General, you still don't understand what you're fighting. The Void Shepherds aren't just trying to conquer territory or steal resources. They want to erase every trace of intelligent life from this galaxy. There is no compromise, no negotiation, no survival except through complete victory." She gestured toward the human ships gathering around her flagship. "Every person in this fleet volunteered knowing they probably wouldn't survive this mission. We came here to save a galaxy that barely tolerates our existence. We're going to finish the job, even if it kills every last one of us." The attack began with a coordinated missile barrage from maximum range. Thousands of conventional warheads struck the Void Shepherd formation, causing minimal damage but forcing the enemy to activate their defensive systems. As reality distortion, fields came online and exotic weapons began charging. The human fleet accelerated toward the center of the enemy formation. What followed was the most desperate and violent space battle in galactic history. Human ships designed for atmospheric flight as much as space combat, twisted and maneuvered through distorted space-time like fighters rather than capital vessels. They took damage that would have destroyed any other ships, held together by crews who refused to stop fighting even when their hulls were coming apart around them. The UES Courage was the first to reach the enemy fortress platforms. Captain Williams, a veteran of Earth's atmospheric wars, drove his ship directly into the reality distortion field protecting the nearest enemy vessel. The destroyer's hull began to dissolve as space-time twisted around it, but Williams held course until he was close enough to deploy his biological weapons. The virus-laden missiles struck the Void Shepherd vessel just as the Courage disintegrated. For a moment, nothing seemed to happen. Then the enemy ship's lights began to flicker and fade as the biological agent attacked the neural pathways connecting its organic and mechanical components. "It's working," Dr. Vasquez reported from her station aboard the Defiance. "The fortress platform is losing power across all systems, but the victory came at a terrible cost." The Courage and its crew of 200 were gone, reduced to scattered atoms in the twisted space around the enemy vessel. It was a trade that would have been unthinkable to any civilized species, but to the humans, it was just another necessary sacrifice. More human ships followed Williams into the enemy formation. The UES Tempest, the UES Vengeance, the UES Determination, all drove themselves against the reality distortion fields protecting the Void Shepherd platforms. Some managed to deploy their biological weapons before being destroyed. Others were torn apart before they could complete their missions. All of them kept fighting until the very end. The alien crews watched in amazement and horror as these Deathworlders threw themselves into certain destruction without hesitation. It violated every principle of military conduct they had ever learned, but it was undeniably effective. One by one, the fortress platforms went dark as biological weapons severed the connections between their organic and mechanical systems. Admiral Chen felt each loss like a physical blow, but she never wavered in her determination. When the Defiance finally reached the center of the enemy formation, surrounded by the wreckage of half the human fleet, she gave the order that would determine the fate of the galaxy. "All remaining ships concentrate fire on the command vessel. This ends now." The combined firepower of human and alien ships struck the largest Void Shepherd platform simultaneously. Biological weapons, nuclear warheads, particle beams, and exotic energy weapons all found their targets at point-blank range. The ancient vessel, which had consumed countless civilizations across millions of years, finally met something more determined than itself. The explosion was visible from 3 star systems away. When the light faded, the command vessel was gone, taking with it the central intelligence that had coordinated the Void Shepherd invasion. The surviving enemy ships, suddenly cut off from their command structure, began to drift aimlessly through space. The battle was over, but the cost had been devastating. Of the 31 human ships that had entered the fight, only 7 remained. Thousands of the galaxy's bravest defenders had given their lives to achieve this victory. The alien crews who survived would carry the memory of human sacrifice for the rest of their lives. As reports came in from across the galaxy, it became clear that the victory was complete. Void Shepherd forces everywhere had gone dormant, their biological components severed from their mechanical systems. The threat that had consumed entire civilizations was finally ended. General Korath approached Admiral Chen as she stood among the wreckage of her fleet. His forearms trembled with exhaustion and awe. "Admiral, I owe you an apology. When we first met, I thought your species was too primitive to understand real warfare. I was wrong. We were the primitives. We had forgotten what it means to fight for survival." Sarah looked out at the drifting hulks of Void Shepherd vessels and at the few human ships that had survived the final assault. "General, there's something you need to understand about humans. We're not brave because we don't feel fear. We're brave because we feel fear and do what needs to be done anyway." She turned to face the alien commander. "Your species will rebuild and grow stronger. The galaxy will remember this day as the moment when civilization itself was saved. But it was only possible because someone was willing to take that first step forward when everyone else stepped back." The aftermath of the battle saw humanity's status in the Galactic Confederation transformed overnight. The species that had once been barely tolerated as dangerous primitives were now recognized as the guardians of galactic civilization. Monuments were erected to honor the human crews who had sacrificed themselves, and Earth received diplomatic recognition as one of the Confederation's core worlds. But for Sarah Chen and the survivors of the human fleet,